Recent Twitter discourse compels me to remind you, home cooking is regressive, NIMBY-aligned, problematically gendered, and ultimately a means of reifying existing class structures. The revolution will not be prepared in your kitchen. It will be served to you at a restaurant.
Telling people to cook is classist. What happens if someone doesn't have the utensils to cook a meal? Food shouldn't be costing that much.
This video is sponsored by Surfshark.
So every few months, we repeat some version of this discourse on my favorite psychic damage repository, twitter.com. Cooking your own food or telling people to cook their own food is bad, actually. But is home cooking a regressive, NIMBY-aligned means of reifying existing class structures? Is cooking classist? No. Thanks for watching the video, everyone. Subscribe to my Patreon and don't forget to like and ring that bell. I'm kidding. No, the act of preparing food for consumption is not inherently classist. That hopefully doesn't need to be said. But much of the advice offered to poor people struggling to feed themselves and their families can be kind of classist and out of touch. And at least in the United States, the home-cooked meal has come to represent something more than sustenance. Home cooking has become symbolic of health, of family, of togetherness, prosperity, community. We celebrate and commiserate with home-cooked meals. Social and political movements have been fueled by meals out of home kitchens, and experts on everything from nutrition to childhood development have stressed the importance of getting back in the kitchen. So it isn't that much of a surprise that home cooking has become, sort of rhetorically loaded, politically charged. In this video, I want to examine some of the intersections of food and class, and by extension, food and race as they exist in the United States. It's a US-centric video. That's where the majority of the research in my sources was based, but I'm sure a lot of the themes that crop up have parallels in other places in the industrialized world, and even in made-up fantasy settings like Europe or Canada. Hi. I'm Hoots. This is my channel, and today we are going to inject some nuance into twitter.com discourse, honey. This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. When I'm doing research for a video essay, or more often than not nowadays, for my comedy history podcast, Respect the Dead, I often find myself watching movies and television shows on the topic of the episode. Or just watching Frozen 2 or the Mummy series 47 times in a row and taking notes. When I sometimes get into trouble is when I want to watch a film or a documentary series and it isn't available in my location. Luckily, there's Surfshark VPN. Virtual private networks like those provided by Surfshark allow me to do a little magic trick and change my location without ever having to leave my home. See, look at this. With one little flick of a switch, I've changed my location to the UK and I can watch Bake Off. How relevant to the topic of this video. Additionally, Surfshark VPN keeps your online identity safe by encrypting all of the information being sent between your device and the internet, which keeps your data safe from big companies and cybercriminals. As someone who loves to do a little bit of online shopping on the public Wi-Fi networks at my day job, I'm just going ahead and assuming that this feature has saved me hundreds of dollars in fraudulent charges a year. Surfshark is offering my audience an additional 3 months free if they go to my link in the description and enter code HOOTS at checkout. That's protecting your data and being able to change your location for the monthly price of a cup of coffee simply by heading to surfshark.deals/hoots. Help out the folks who help me by signing up for Surfshark VPN today. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. I appreciate every company that has reached out to me to offer sponsorships, but if I'm being honest with you, I wish I didn't have to take them. Sponsorships put more pressure on me to meet deadlines, and I feel like the ad integrations and calls to action hurt the flow of my videos. Ideally, I'd like to get to a place where I can afford to make 4 to 6 high-quality videos a year about topics I feel strongly about instead of feeling like I have to rush out a Christmas special that no one wants to watch in order to pay my rent. But right now, between Patreon and AdSense, I'm not making anywhere near the hourly minimum wage, so I have to take sponsorships to supplement my income, especially in months when hours at my day job are limited. In a video where I'm going to be discussing class to some extent, I think it's relevant to point out that YouTube has given me more financial security than I have ever had. And yet I'm still falling short and suffering from burnout and creative frustration simply trying to keep up with the rising cost of living. If you've liked any of my work and you have the money to spare, please consider signing up for my Patreon at patreon.com/littlehoot. Please don't feel pressured if you're in a similar position to me, but if you happened to drop a Disney Plus subscription in the last few months for some reason and suddenly have a few extra dollars with which to supplement your favorite little hoot, I'd really appreciate it. Now let's make some breakfast. One of about 1 million different ways to make rice porridge, aka congee. Take a cup of white rice and rinse it lightly. You don't want to soak too much because you need that starch. Then add some broth or water to a large pan and bring to a boil. You want between 6 and 10 cups of liquid for every cup of rice. Add the rice and bring back up to a boil before lowering to a simmer for about 25 to 30 minutes, stirring occasionally so that the rice doesn't stick to the pan. You could also add some ginger or some garlic to the simmer. Stir in a half teaspoon of MSG at the end for a little flavor and serve with whatever protein, veggies, hot sauce you fancy. Alternatively, serve it plain as the perfect brat meal for when you're feeling sick and your tummy hurts. So, one of the last times the discourse around cooking went really off the rails, I saw this interaction in someone's replies. A person recommends, somewhat unhelpfully if you ask me, rice as a cheap food staple for poor people. And someone responds, somewhat strangely if you ask me, that just rice isn't food. That's my favorite breakfast, screaming, crying, throwing up. And I just love that attitude juxtaposed next to the poster who thinks they've just introduced the proles to the concept of bagged rice. This is social media-induced brain rot at its absolute finest. I'm gonna make an ass out of you and me and assume that both of these people are feigning some degree of ignorance in order to win an argument with a stranger on the internet. Bagged rice person definitely knows that they're not blowing any minds by pointing out that bagged rice is cheap. And just rice isn't food person knows that bagged rice person probably wasn't recommending people only buy bags of rice and nothing else. These are the moments we need to learn to log off and walk away. But the just rice isn't food comment did stick with me. Just rice isn't food, at least not in the long term. You must not have been able to find an actual food and had to resort to this. This was not the first time I had heard of rice being categorically brushed aside as something less than actual food, like it's nothing more than nutritionless filler, the culinary equivalent of packing peanuts. And that's weird to me, because rice is food, even by itself. Sure, it's nothing fancy, but even white rice, the kind everyone says is the most unhealthy, has dietary fiber, vitamin B6, and between 3 to 4 grams of protein per serving. Some rice hater behavior is definitely down to American diet culture and the demonization of carbohydrates over the last 40 years, and some people would happily lump other starches like potatoes and bread into the same shameful category as rice. But Western ideas about rice have also been shaped by a rice discourse dating back to the 18th century. From the 18th to the early 20th centuries, people in Europe and America loved two things: the dramatic highs and lows of a robust game of hoop and stick, and race science. So when the nascent field of dietary science started to emerge in 18th century Paris, the greatest philosophers and thinkers of the day were like, okay, but what does all this mean for the white race? Colonial France had a significant presence in South and East Asia, and French Enlightenment debate bros set to work settling one of the most important questions in early dietary science. Who has the best carb? Asians with their rice, or frogs with their pans? Leave a comment and tell me which modern debate bro is which Enlightenment era debate bro in your personal headcanon. I promise you I will not read them. The assumption in the 18th century was that rice was easy to digest, whereas bread was not. And thinkers of the day wanted to extrapolate from this whole categories of people: rice eaters and bread eaters. Like your Myers-Briggs personality type, only racist. like your Myers-Briggs personality type. Intellectuals like Voltaire suggested that rice-based diets made South Asians feeble and passive, but journalist Simon Nicolas-Henri Linguet argued that the French population's consumption of bread made them a little too uppity, a little too guillotine-y, whereas rice, by contrast, gave Asians smooth digestion and tranquil political orders, whatever that means. Playwright Jean-François de la Harpe argued that rice-based food was for effeminate peoples and held up bread as a symbol of European hegemony. And white people being weird about rice wasn't just limited to France. Voltaire's theories of rice-based diets were eventually used by 19th century British imperialists to defend the British Raj, and an American neurologist by the name of James Leonard Corning wrote in 1884, "The effeminate rice eaters of India and China have again and again yielded to the superior moral courage of an infinitely smaller number of meat-eating Englishmen." Rice eating was historically consistently conflated with both effeminacy and vegetarianism, which were viewed as threats to white Western masculinity. In the American interwar period, gastropolitics became intertwined with American attitudes towards Chinese immigrants. In Angels and Vegetables, A Brief History of Food Advice in America, E. Melanie Dupuy writes, "The Asian body became the sign of colonial subjugation and effeminacy, while the tall, meat-eating, and milk-drinking masculine American working-class body signified the superiority of the white diet." This characterization served as justification for white imperial projects in the post-World War I era. Colonial non-meat eaters were viewed as conquered peoples, defeated by diet. In their shared disdain for non-white races, the working and middle class found a common identity as members of a powerful nation. Echoes of these imperial moral panics around Western masculinity and diet persist in the reactionary hand-wringing over soy. Soy boys are depicted as effeminate, weak cuckolds, as opposed to their roided-out meat-eating counterparts. And it's interesting that soy, a legume of East Asian origin, has specifically been singled out for feminizing our men. Manosphere types have been awfully quiet about corn and kidney beans, fruit, donuts, all of the other things vegetarians and vegans might eat besides soy. But it isn't just Western chauvinists who moralize certain ethnic cuisine. In their book, Pressure Cooker, Why Home Cooking Won't Solve Our Problems and What We Can Do About It, Sarah Bowen, Jocelyn Brenton, and Seneca Elliott point out, food reformers have long made claims about the moral superiority of particular foods and sought to convert poor people, people of color, and immigrants to new ways of eating. Foods from immigrant communities that are now assimilated into American culture, like hot dogs and pizza, were once described by nutrition reformers as garlicky, overstimulating, and a real tax on digestion. "Still eating spaghetti, not yet assimilated," wrote one social worker after visiting an Italian household. MSG described in The Joy of Cooking as the mysterious white powder of the Orient still has not recovered from its reputation for causing mysterious cases of Chinese restaurant syndrome in the 1970s and 1980s. In reality, MSG is basically just salt with a kind of vegetable or seaweed extract that serves as a flavor enhancer. And Chinese restaurant syndrome was a fictitious disease based on a flawed study. Chinese restaurant syndrome is just Havana syndrome for xenophobes. Chinese restaurant syndrome is just Havana syndrome. I've noticed a little bit of a xenophobic, racist pattern when it comes to the foods and food additives that spark moral panics or whose nutritional content are the subject of intense scrutiny. Pressure Cooker points out how the foods associated with health and wellness are usually the healthy foods white people like. Despite its diverse population, the United States has yet to truly embrace diverse definitions of healthy eating. The foods identified as healthy, like broccoli and asparagus, are foods stereotypically associated with white diets. Why not okra, one might ask? Why not black-eyed peas? This isn't to say that all foods associated with whiteness are considered healthy. No one is making any broad claims about the health benefits of Wonder Bread and potato salad with raisins in it. But just as the vegetables white people eat are more likely to be associated with health than the ones ethnic minorities eat, the unhealthy foods associated with minorities are more heavily scrutinized than the unhealthy foods of their white counterparts. There have been ongoing intra and extra community debates for decades now over whether fry bread is killing Indigenous Americans or whether soul food is killing Black Americans. And no. If you stop and think about it for more than 30 seconds, it's pretty obvious that one high-calorie dish or one rich Sunday dinner is not responsible for disproportionate rates of diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease in minority communities. These are communities that are disproportionately affected by food insecurity, that are more likely to live in food deserts. Black Americans are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts, and many prisoners end up developing conditions like diabetes and heart disease as the result of heavily processed, nutritionally inadequate prison food. To add insult to injury, a 2021 study found that junk food companies spent up to 73% of their advertising budgets on television ads targeting Black and Latino consumers. Because if a community is more likely to live in a food desert where the only foods available in a 5-mile radius are the Coca-Cola and Nabisco products sold at their local gas station, you better know Coca-Cola and Nabisco are going to send that community repeated reminders that the sugary drinks and salty chips are right around the corner, unlike the produce section of the nearest supermarket. So fucking sinister. All right, all this talk of systemic racism and xenophobia and soy has fulfilled the chud engagement bait portion of this video. While they type out diatribes about the evils of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the comments, we should probably figure out what to have for lunch. Ratatouille. Peel and chop an eggplant and a couple zucchini, toss them with olive oil and salt, and let them sit for 30 minutes. Roughly chop an onion and 1 or 2 bell peppers. Fry the eggplant and zucchini in more olive oil until lightly browned and set aside. Fry the onion and bell pepper with some sliced or minced garlic and even more olive oil and a bunch of fresh sprigs of thyme. I tied mine together in a bundle using one of the sprigs. Add a pint of cherry tomatoes and cook until they start to burst. Stir in the zucchini and eggplant. Pour another pint of cherry tomatoes on top and season with plenty of salt and pepper. Put in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 to 20 minutes. Serve with crusty bread and brie. Ratatouille has had an interesting journey as a dish. Side note that Kaylin Conrad thinks the word dish is a very funny and silly way to refer to a meal, so if you're a fan of Kaylin, pause this video right now and go comment dish with no context whatsoever on whatever Kaylin's most recent upload is, just because I think it's funny. I think the idea of them getting dish comments in perpetuity is funny. I know this might be considered targeted harassment of my best friend, but I'm not sorry. The Southern French delicacy began as simple peasants' fare, a humble stew of whatever garden vegetables were available to the poor, before being refined into the icon of Niçoise cuisine that eventually got its own fucking Disney Pixar movie. As an aside, the ratatouille in Ratatouille is technically confipialdi, a more labor-intensive spin on the traditional dish created by Michelin-starred chef Michel Guérard. Ratatouille's producer, Brad Lewis, interned at also Michelin-starred Thomas Keller's The French Laundry in Napa Valley as part of his research for the film. Allegedly, the decision to serve confipialdi to the critic in the film was Keller's idea. Ratatouille's rags to riches narrative parallels that of many legendary restaurateurs who have clawed their way out of poverty through the power of good cooking and ingenuity. Harry M. Stevens, a British immigrant who'd started a concessions company in 1887, had the misfortune of working a New York Giants baseball game on a cold, rainy day in 1901. Game concessions at the time consisted mostly of ice cream and peanuts, nothing that would keep the crowds of baseball fans warm and cozy in the rain. So he sent his son, Frank, to buy up all of the German sausages in the neighborhood and some rolls to place them in, thereby inventing the great American hot dog and making Harry M. Stevens into an American icon. Richard Montañez began as a lowly janitor for the Frito-Lay company, where he managed to score some naked Cheetos one day and took them home, tossing them in a mixture of chili powder and other spices and inventing the Flamin' Hot Cheeto. When he presented his spicy Cheeto concoction to Frito-Lay C-suite executives, everyone stood up and clapped. And then they made him vice president at PepsiCo. And Ann Baylor, the founder and CEO of the crown jewel of your local mall's food court, Auntie Anne's Pretzels. This is wild, guys. Auntie Anne grew up horse and buggy Amish, but her family eventually became a modern kind of Amish that I'd never heard of before researching this video, called Black Car Amish, which allows for a handful of modern technologies, including the ability to drive cars as long as they're black. She got married to her husband Jonas at the age of 19, and in 1975, their 19-month-old daughter was killed when she was hit by a tractor on their family farm. To quote Anne, "My life turned upside down. My husband and I weren't able to connect emotionally, and I sought counseling with a pastor outside the Amish Mennonite community." And do you know what the fuck happened next, dear viewers? No, shut up. This is a video essay about Auntie Ann Baylor now. What happened next is that piece of shit pastor raped her, and she was so ashamed that she kept it quiet, and he kept sexually abusing her for another 6 fucking years. Eventually, Anne decided that enough was enough, and she told her family and church leadership, who investigated the pastor and found out that of fucking course he was abusing other women in the church, and he was eventually fired and his license was revoked. As part of their healing journey as a family, Auntie Anne's husband, Jonas, became a licensed family counselor and started offering his services for free to the community. And Anne started selling her pretzels after a friend told her that the local Amish pretzel store was pretty popular. And the business she founded did absolutely gangbusters. And nowadays, you can feel bad about yourself eating one of her soft pretzels outside of a Victoria's Secret store in every state in the goddamn union. Stan Auntie Anne. I'm an Auntie Stan. Except only one of those 3 anecdotes I just told was true. You've heard of 2 truths and a lie? Well, when you're talking about corporate origin stories, you have to play 2 lies and a truth, because most corporate origin stories are lies. Harry M. Stevens almost certainly did not invent the hot dog, and he became a concessions magnate not through quick thinking on a rainy day, but through the boring acquisition of vending contracts with a number of Major League Baseball teams. More than a dozen Frito-Lay employees who worked at the corporation while Richard Montañez claimed to be inventing the Flamin' Hot Cheeto there have contradicted his story. So too has the official Frito-Lay archival record. Yes, American junk food conglomerates have historic archives. Of course they have fucking historic archives. Montañez did live out some of his Cinderella story. Like the part about starting as a janitor and eventually becoming VP of PepsiCo is real. There are employment records backing that up. But he didn't get crowned the king of hot chips for inventing them or whatever. Montañez just made that part up because it makes for a way better biopic directed by Eva Longoria. And that buck fucking wild Auntie Anne story, that's the one truth. But it obviously isn't the whole truth, right? I mean, sure, overcoming adversity and founding a successful business is part of it, but my audience knows more than most that one doesn't become the queen of a pretzel empire through sheer force of will and a product that people want to buy. There's also a lot of exploitation involved. But here's the thing. When we're talking about food, there's always a lot of exploitation involved, like more so than other industries and along more links in the chain than other industries. Whether it's union-busting corporate fast food chains, the local mom and pop success story that started out of a home kitchen and stays afloat with a staff made up of the underpaid or unpaid children of the owners, or the generic store brand coffee grounds I used to fuel myself through the making of this video. Everything we eat or drink comes at a moral and ethical cost. Far from being the places where the revolution will be served to you, Restaurants operate on infamously razor-thin margins. United States federal law allows for restaurant owners to pay tipped employees far lower than the federally mandated minimum wage in order to offset the cost of having employees. Only 7 states mandate that employers pay out tipped employees the same minimum wage as untipped employees. In the other 43, waitstaff count on your tips to supplement their sub-minimum wages. And in 16 of those, as well as 2 U.S. territories, tipped employees are paid as little as $2.13 an hour. And many restaurants make their waitstaff, hosts, bussers, and bar staff pool tips. So if one person gets a decent tip, everyone working that night has a good night. If one person gets stiffed, everyone suffers. And of course, the restaurant industry is also notorious for wage theft. This all gets further complicated when you add in delivery apps, which allow you to tip your driver, and you should always tip your driver, but make it difficult or sometimes impossible to tip restaurant staff. Additionally, platforms like Grubhub and DoorDash charge restaurants fees up to 30% for every order you place, which sometimes means they end up losing money on delivery orders they fulfill. Independent restaurateurs, once eager to be featured on apps so that locals discover their businesses, have accused delivery apps of killing restaurants, and many smaller restaurants are opting out of the apps entirely. In fact, a great deal of the independent restaurants you'll still find on Uber Eats and Grubhub nowadays are actually ghost kitchens being run by IHOP and Mr. Beast. In her expose/travelogue/love letter to hot dogs, Raw Dog, Jamie Loftus kind of sums up the meatpacking industry best. Look, you don't need to be a soldier for the cause to realize that the reality of factory farms is an integrated scheme to exploit everyone involved but those at the top. The animals are treated without mercy by underpaid employees who in turn make an unhealthy product to be marketed to the poor, who consume and shorten their own lifespans by enjoying it. Maybe the hot dog is American after all. Telling my kids this was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Jamie Loftus is not a vegetarian, or at least wasn't when she wrote Raw Dog, as evidenced by the fact that almost the entire book is about her traveling the country eating America's many and varied hot dogs. But the chapter early in the book, titled "Here is How You Make a Hot Dog," would cause any sympathetic meat-eating reader to consider swapping to a Beyond sausage at their next cookout. Yes, there is the requisite description of abject animal cruelty that I will spare you the details of, but even more book real estate is dedicated to the extreme mistreatment of laborers in the slaughterhouse and meatpacking industries. Ghoulish gag laws emerging in the 1990s made it a crime for anyone, though primarily targeting activists and employees, to document anything on the grounds of a meat plant in order to prove abuse or other legal violations. In the early 2000s, the meatpacking industry held the highest rate of job-related illnesses and injuries at around 27%, with workers describing the need to wear chest pads and hockey masks to avoid being injured from improperly killed or distressed livestock. Joe Warwick of the Washington Post spoke with a Florida beef plant technician in 2001 about the workers' reality at the slaughterhouse. Speak up, lose your livelihood. When hidden camera footage was released of Tyson Foods slaughterhouse employees, then making $9 an hour to kill more than 200 cattle in a single shift, could be seen stunning cows that later woke up and were killed while still conscious. Pressure was put on workers to sign statements saying they had never seen live cattle on the slaughter line. The company's reaction was a predictable one, scapegoating individual migrant workers and bullying others into doing the same in order to retain their employment. Similar reports have been made of many American meat processing plants, notably a report from the Los Angeles Times in 2015 revealing that the USDA had declined to punish Farmer John hot dogs in Vernon, California for repeatedly failing to stun pigs being prepared for slaughter. Loftus dedicates a lot of the book to recounting the way meatpacking and slaughterhouse employees were essentially sacrificed during the early days of the 2020 COVID outbreak in order to maintain pre-pandemic rates of production on cheap meat for American consumers. I know some people think that not having meat at every meal is a famine or whatever, but I personally think that Tyson and Hormel probably could have at least temporarily slowed production enough that they needed fewer employees working in abattoirs and plants at any given time for social distancing purposes. And maybe they could have provided their employees with some PPE, considering their profits rose by 120% between 2020 and 2021. If you are one of the millions of people who has chosen to eliminate or reduce your meat consumption due to abuses and mistreatment in the factory farm industry, then great. That is one part of the exploitative food industrial complex that you can actually opt out of and, survive. Also, simply reducing your red meat and dairy intake is one of the best things you can do for your health and for the environment. As in, you can make a dramatic impact by only having a cheeseburger every third meal instead of your normal 3 cheeseburger a day diet. However, farm workers outside of the animal agricultural industry aren't exempt from mistreatment and exploitation. Pesticides used in the raising and processing of crops put farm workers at elevated risk of chronic diseases, including cancer and birth defects. About 1/5 of farm workers in the U.S. live below the poverty line, and a disproportionate number of farm workers are undocumented, which means they don't have access to any public benefits, including the Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children, health insurance through programs like Medicaid, or food stamps. These workers are instrumental in bringing us the food that we eat, and in turn, they are shut out of access to most of it. Ironically, access to food in a country that produces 80 million tons of food waste a year is a dire concern for the 44 million Americans facing hunger and food insecurity. And with soaring food costs, that number may be on the rise. The United States Department of Agriculture reported a significant rise in food insecurity in 2022, and their official thrifty food plan for February of 2024, the USDA's most cost-effective plan, estimated that for the average family of 4 to fully meet their nutritional needs, they'd need to spend around $976.60 on groceries for the month. That's not inclusive of meals out or daily trips to Starbucks. That's just meals and snacks made at home with groceries bought from the store. How are low-income, hell, even middle-income families meant to afford to keep themselves adequately fed when the nutritional bare minimum is estimated to cost them nearly $1,000 a month? The conventional advice is to become a more economic and efficient shopper. Shop sales, clip coupons, resist the urge to make impulse purchases. Pressure Cooker looks at this idea in depth. For a long time, experts have told women they can overcome meager budgets and hectic schedules by being more efficient household managers. At the turn of the 20th century, advocates of rational eating calculated the calories per dollar for different foods in order to show shoppers how to get the most nourishment for the least money. Economical eating became so popular that middle-class women hosted poverty luncheons, competing to see who could host the most elaborate meal on the smallest budget. Prices of food and other consumer goods rose sharply due to inflation during and after World War I. The costs of rent, food, clothing, and other living expenses doubled between 1913 and 1920. Rather than focusing on the political and economic conditions that were pushing prices up, people blamed shoppers for not managing their resources wisely. In 1914, the president of the National Housewives League argued that wasted food dollars were due to women's ignorance of market conditions, naive trust of grocers, and laziness. She declared, "With the high cost of living one of the most pressing questions of the day, the average American housewife is sitting complacently by, absolutely indifferent to the situation that confronts her." In short, women were expected to solve the problem of rising food costs by being better, wiser, and more efficient shoppers. Today, as back then, shoppers are expected to successfully economize while still maintaining a healthy diet, even as the standards for what constitutes healthy continue to ramp up. The image of the efficient housewife is alive and well, argues sociologist Shelley Koch. Consumers must be rational and efficient with their time and money and adopt strategies like clipping coupons, shopping sales, and even leaving their children at home or shopping on a full stomach in order to avoid unnecessary purchases. Pressure Cooker also gives the lie to this idea by showing that poor people are already doing this. Bowen, Brenton, and Elliott's research involved interviewing over 150 low and middle-income mothers and grandmothers in the Raleigh area over the course of 5 years, and they documented the lives of 9 of those women in the book, following them as they shopped, cooked, and attempted to feed their families. One of the women, Ashley Taylor, shops with a coupon binder organized by store section. She knows many of the prices of products by heart, and she knows exactly what her total should come out to when she checks out. And yet, still, she sometimes goes over budget. Many of the women the book documents receive SNAP benefits and WIC vouchers for food and still have to sometimes make end-of-the-month decisions like whether to pay a hospital bill or whether to buy food for their family. And some women, like Patricia Washington, who lives in a hotel with her daughter and grandchildren, don't have the choice of making inexpensive home-cooked meals. With only a microwave available to them, the only hot meals Patricia can serve her grandchildren are prepared foods, which quickly add up. The conventional advice to shop more efficiently to save money might be helpful to some higher-income families, but for low- and middle-income families, it's similar to telling young people that they could afford a house if only they stopped buying coffee and avocado toast. Food banks and food pantries can be a great supplementary option for some low-income families, but not everyone qualifies, and they aren't going to meet everyone's needs. Many food pantries, which often struggle to keep up with demand, don't allow food recipients to pick their own groceries. They just have to take what they're given. Now, you may think that that is the way it should be. People getting low-cost or no-cost food should just take whatever slop they get. I think that attitude sucks on just a gut level. People should be able to make their own dietary and culinary choices, whether or not they can afford to go to a grocery store. But it's an attitude that sucks even more when you consider the prevalence of food allergies. And a 2023 study that suggested that people of color are disproportionately affected by them. People of color also disproportionately face food insecurity and benefit from food assistance programs like food banks. Recently, the cost of groceries has spiked so much that it's even caused some people to ask, is it now cheaper to eat out than cook at home?
Restaurants, if we go out, is it cheaper to do that or stay home and cook?
No. Even though restaurant prices have seen less of a dramatic rise than grocery store prices, most meals are still more cost-effective to make at home. I'm not going to say all meals. Like, you probably are going to get a cheaper burger off the McDonald's dollar menu than one you could make at home because of economies of scale, but like, that isn't anything new. As a general rule, food cooked at home is going to cost you less in terms of pure dollars and cents. However, when we're talking about food and cost, we're not just talking about cash. Cooking and eating out can have dramatically different time costs, depending on a number of factors. Everyone who's made a 30-minute meal recipe that's actually taken the better part of an hour, or who thought they were saving time by hitting the In-N-Out drive-thru on the way to work and ended up clocking in 20 minutes late, can tell you that when it comes to feeding yourself, you should always budget for more time than you need. And some people simply don't have any more time to budget. Low-income families have less control over their time than higher-income families. Hourly shift employees usually work inconsistent schedules and are only given their schedules on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. This leaves workers with limited capacity to plan out things like childcare, ride shares, and yes, their weekly meals. And people that reside in food deserts have added time costs if they want to access healthy food. Food deserts are a fairly new concept. Research into the effects of food deserts on health is still unclear, and how to define what is or isn't a food desert is still a little vague. But essentially, Any place where access to foods like fresh produce is extremely limited can be considered a kind of food desert. Many minority and low-income neighborhoods in major cities qualify as food deserts, along with many rural areas. People living in these communities may need to drive 10 or more miles to get to their nearest grocery store. And if they don't have access to a car, they could be faced with expensive taxi fares or several hours commuting via public transport with bags of groceries. Again, research on food deserts' effects on public health is still pretty inconclusive, but a lot of liberal politicians have taken up the mantle of addressing them as a possible solution for poverty-related illnesses like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. The assumption is that people living in food deserts end up eating junk food more often than not because fresh food isn't more readily available, and build more Walmarts feels like a simple solution. And easy to sell to political donors to boot. But while I agree that no one should have to travel more than a mile for fresh produce, I have to wonder if the reason grocery chains pulled out of those communities in the first place is because the people who live there don't actually have the money to spend on fresh food, and that until and unless we actually address the structural causes of poverty, poor people are still going to be faced with limited food access and negative health outcomes. Just now there's going to be a Whole Foods in the neighborhood. In every possible way, the deck is stacked against poor people when it comes to accessing adequate nutrition. And it's only adding insult to injury that many of those poor people, from the waitress making $2.13 an hour at your local diner, to the Uber Eats driver making $2.13 an hour bringing you soggy pancakes and bacon from your local diner, to the undocumented workers making $2.13 an hour, slaughtering the pig that made the bacon that came with the pancakes you ordered on Uber Eats from your local diner, are responsible for feeding everyone else. Everyone is getting fucked over here. Roll that Jamie Loftus quote again. Factory farms is an integrated scheme to exploit everyone involved but those at the top. The animals are treated without mercy by underpaid employees who in turn make an unhealthy product to be marketed to the poor, who consume and shorten their own lifespans by enjoying it. Well, this has put me off my lunch. Maybe I'll be hungrier at dinner time. All right, a rich-ass baked mac and cheese you can serve as a side or a main. Whisk together 3 tablespoons of flour and butter, 2 cups of whole milk, ground mustard seed, cayenne pepper, and onion powder in a pan over medium-high heat until the mixture starts to thicken. Stir in about a pound of mixed cheeses. I have 2 different kinds of cheddar, Asiago, and Fontana here, and simmer until thickened a little. Bring some salted water up to a boil and pour in your pasta of choice and cook to your desired level of doneness. Use 1 pound of pasta for a drier mac and cheese, or less if you want a creamier, richer mac and cheese. Stir the noodles into the cheese sauce. Add half of the pasta and cheese sauce into a ceramic baking dish or cast iron. Top with even more cheese. Add the other half of the noodles and sauce. Top with more cheese. Yes, mama, all the cheese. Top with some panko breadcrumbs. I definitely added too much here. Don't add as much as I did. Bake at 350 for 30 minutes. Serve with a refreshing citrus salad to offset the rich mac and a glass of full-bodied red wine. Thomas Jefferson is often credited with introducing macaroni and cheese to the United States, but it was actually his enslaved cook, James Hemings, who brought the dish over from France in the latter part of the 18th century. Jefferson wanted Hemings to learn from the finest French chefs and expand his craft as one of the skilled artisans he kept as human chattel. So he brought Hemings with him when he was awarded a diplomatic appointment in France in 1784, enrolling James Hemings in a prestigious apprenticeship at Chateau de Chantilly. Jefferson also later sent for James's sister, Sally Hemings, and once she arrived in Paris, started raping her. I know there are still people who are like, we don't actually know the nature of their relationship, but shut up, it was rape. There was no consent between a slave owner and a fucking slave. Thomas Jefferson doesn't get to have it both ways. He doesn't get to be like, oh, black people aren't human, they're property, but also we're in love. Grow up. At Chantilly, James Hemings learned not only how to make macaroni and cheese, but creme brulee, meringue, and whipped cream. Even the classic American freedom fry was actually born in France and emigrated by way of one James Hemings. Jefferson and James and Sally Hemings returned to Virginia in 1789. While in France, James and Sally Hemings could have legally sued Thomas Jefferson for their freedom. It's unclear why they didn't, but some historians speculate that it's because they would have been separated from their family members who remained at Monticello. However, beginning in 1793, James Hemings approached Jefferson about negotiating the terms of his freedom. Jefferson agreed that after more than a decade of faithful service, James should be allowed his freedom under the sole condition that he train his replacement, his younger brother, Peter. The process took 3 years, but in 1796, Thomas Jefferson wrote the deed of manumission. James Hemings was freed, and his brother took his place as the cook at Monticello. James Hemings died by suicide in 1801 at the age of 36. It's kind of hard to overstate what an influential chef James Hemings was on the American palate. That dishes like macaroni and cheese and French fries have become staples throughout the nation is completely down to his influence, and yet most people have never heard of him. Historically, food and cooking has been one of the very few avenues through which Black Americans, Black women especially, could gain and wield any power. Throughout American history, homes in Black neighborhoods were built and church mortgages were paid with money earned making food. Several of the marches, protests, and other acts of resistance during the Civil Rights era were planned at many of the country's famous Black restaurants. Even the term soul food is a political designation that arose in the 1960s, meant to identify certain foods as a point of pride and culture for African Americans. Sidebar, I recognize I've brought up soul food several times in this video. I think it's just because I grew up in the South and there's a lot of overlap between Southern food and soul food, so it's just an example I find really accessible. Despite the overlap, soul food and Southern food aren't always interchangeable, and soul food actually has a lot of distinct regional variations. I think Black food history as its own topic is incredibly interesting and dense, but for pretty obvious reasons, I'm not equipped to discuss it on this channel. So I'm going to link off to a really great intellectual media video called A Buffet of Black Food History that you should watch 3 or 4 times just as a crash course on that particular topic. Certain foods are elevated or moralized under white supremacy, and other foods are symbols of resistance, of perseverance under unimaginable horror and adversity. Laborers tasked with bringing us the food we eat are and always have been crushed in the wheels of industrialization, and whole neighborhoods have been paid for thanks to the labor of generations of women of color working in kitchens. Food isn't apolitical. The way we prepare it, cook it, get it, sell it, eat it isn't apolitical. I hope that this far into the video essay that much is clear. Is cooking classist? Dude, I don't even know what that question means anymore. Yeah? No? I guess. Who cares? I think I have cultivated the kind of audience who try to have good politics, who try to do whatever they can to promote as much good in the world as is within their own capabilities. I admire that about you, you know. And at this point, you may be wondering what the call to action is. What is it that you can do to alleviate the problematic thing in an entire industrialized system of problematic things? In the 1990s and 2000s, the idea of voting with one's fork and voting with one's wallet gained a lot of traction. In our liberal democracies, the onus was placed on the consumer to do your research and shop local, seasonal, organic, vegan, fair trade, and carbon neutral in order to save our waistlines, our children, the nuclear family unit, and the planet. But while some people never moved past that idea, almost everyone who has ever attempted to commit to any kind of ethical consumerism has eaten shit on the exact same stumbling blocks. It's prohibitively expensive and time-consuming, and also companies lie to you. Like, meatpacking companies were lying to the USDA about improperly stunning cattle before slaughter, which is a federal crime. Do you honestly believe that they're telling you the truth when they slap a little label on beef packaging that pinky promises you that they've fed that cow a high-quality grass diet, treated her like a princess, let her roam free, and gave her a little kiss on the forehead before sending her off to be painlessly killed and ground into hamburger meat? Girl, No. Corporations will always choose to cut costs over doing the right thing. And when you tell them that you're willing to pay more for a product that is less cruel, wasteful, or environmentally harmful, they'll take the pay hike and continue to cut costs. Also, a solution that is only a solution for the people who can afford to be part of the solution is not a solution. I've got to get a fucking thesaurus, goddammit. Rather than advocating for a hyper-individualized neoliberal approach, modern activists tend to support food justice, which is a broader movement that seeks to address the systemic and structural disparities that lead to things like food insecurity and safety and quality of life issues in food production. Food justice is about more than just eliminating food deserts and finding alternatives to chemical pesticides. Declaring it a human right to have housing, for example, falls under the food justice umbrella, as access to a kitchen and the ability to make one's own food should be a right and not a privilege. Having a home is a food security issue. Raising wages and establishing universal healthcare and childcare are food security issues. Pressure Cooker puts it best. Since the 1970s, there has been a steady erosion of the social safety net and regulatory protections in the United States. Real wages have stagnated, and unlike other wealthy nations, the United States lacks policies to help offset the cost of raising children, for example, by offering paid leave to care for children and other family members, childcare subsidies, or universal child or family allowances. If feeding children is more vital than ever before, then families should not have the sole responsibility thrust on them. 1 out of every 8 Americans does not have enough food to eat, and many more do not have enough money to regularly afford healthy foods. The gap in the quality of food that rich and poor people in the United States eat is growing. Food pantries and other charities cannot keep up with the demand. Our federal food assistance programs, food stamps, WIC, and school breakfast and lunch were founded in part on the belief that it is our duty as a nation to make sure that our citizens don't go hungry. But these programs are increasingly subject to debates over whether the people who use them are deserving or dependent and morally suspect. When the government says that food stamps should only be available to working adults, as was proposed in the draft of the Farm Bill released just as we were finishing these conclusions in the book, they are saying that not everyone, not even every child in this country, deserves to be free from hunger. We need to reframe the way we think of food, not as a privilege to be dispensed by charities to people who deserve it, but as a fundamental human right for everyone. The right to food is included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. The United States is one of the only industrialized countries in the world that has not endorsed a right to food. Recognizing food as a human right would mean evaluating policies based on the degree to which they successfully reduce food insecurity. The United States has measured the prevalence of food insecurity in the nation since 1995. In more than 20 years, there has been no measurable improvement. To reduce food insecurity, we must tackle the underlying conditions that cause poverty, while also strengthening our existing food assistance programs, ensuring that they are available to everyone who needs them. This will require raising the minimum wage so that working families are able to feed themselves and investing in affordable housing, given the strong links between housing insecurity and food insecurity. Ultimately, systemic problems are going to take systemic solutions, which means that a lot of the power is in the hands of our leaders who aren't doing a really great job right now, if I'm being honest. Oh boy, the Twitter girlies are really going to come at me for this one. I know telling people to vote is like a cringe liberal meme or whatever, but you should probably do what you can to get progressives and leftists into those down ballot seats. Your local city council has a lot more power than you think, and your current council members are most likely a bunch of fucking landlords. So get them out and get people who actually care about your community in. Support labor unions for everyone working in food production and the food service industry. Don't cross any fucking picket lines. I mean it. Call your congressperson, call your senator, and, most of your representatives' home addresses are public knowledge. If you were looking for the perfect location for your next block party, hire a ska band to play Baby Shark on repeat for 4.5 hours. Invite your nephew's 5th grade class to show you what songs they've learned on the recorder. There are ways to break people. If you're looking for what else you can do, research setting up community fridges and community gardens. Reach out to local churches and community centers and try to set up community kitchen and food events, opportunities for people to eat both food prepared by others and to empower those without the means to make food for themselves. Reach out to local restaurants about taking leftover food. You can distribute it to unhoused, elderly, disabled, and other food insecure neighbors yourself, or again, you can reach out to existing community-led initiatives and places of worship to help you distribute. Get to know your neighbors. Find out who is food insecure or who might need help getting access to food or cooking tools. Find out who might need help walking through the process of applying for food stamps or Section 8 housing. Be the kind of person someone goes to borrow a cup of sugar or a pan or to open a tight jar. It's not enough. It will never be enough without massive systemic change and a significant investment in the social safety net. But for one person, one family, it may be enough to get them through another day. Finnish blueberry pie, hoot style. First, you're going to want to get some cardamom pods and crack them open. You should probably use a kitchen mallet or a nutcracker or even the side of a knife blade, but I'm doing it here with a tablespoon for some fucking reason. Put the cardamom seeds in a plastic bag. They look like rat poops. Use a rolling pin to crush them up nicely. Spread your crushed rat poops on a baking tray and put them in the oven to toast a bit. I think I set it to 325. I don't know. I was just feeling it out. Cream some butter and sugar. This is the mixer that broke my finger, so I'm very nervous using it. Blend in an egg. I had to swap to a pan because the cute little bowl I was trying to use to look cute wasn't big enough. Measure out a cup of flour. I used half all-purpose flour and half rye flour, but if you want a sweeter, softer crust, just use all-purpose. And mix your flour together with a half teaspoon of baking flour. I couldn't find my half teaspoon, so I used my 1/8 teaspoon 4 times like an idiot. Mix in your toasted cardamom seeds. Then combine your wet and dry ingredients to make a dough. Spread the dough along a greased pie pan and put it in the refrigerator next to some almond milk and a month-old container of miso soup to chill. Mix together 2 eggs, 3 tablespoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, 3 tablespoons of lemon juice, and a cup of plain yogurt or sour cream. Don't use Greek yogurt, it's too thick for this recipe. Until smooth. Then get your chilled pie crust and carefully place your mixed berries. You'll need about 2 to 2.5 cups worth. Make sure you place them strategically so that every possible slice of pie has enough of each berry. Pour your pie filling on top. Bake in the oven at 350 for about an hour, then place in the fridge to chill, ideally overnight, but you'll want at least a solid 4 hours. She needs to get cold. Serve with black coffee in a Moomin mug. This is mustikapiraka, which means blueberry pie in Finnish. As the name suggests, it's normally made with just blueberries, but my mom always made it with multiple summer berries. And the way my mom always made it is the correct way. My grandmother's parents came to America in the early 20th century. They settled in a small Finnish-American community on the Oregon coast and barely ever learned a word of English, which I think is iconic. Assimilation is for nerds. I don't actually know why they immigrated, but I'm going to presume they were just looking for a version of Finland with fewer Russians in it. My grandmother and her siblings grew up speaking Finnish at home, but were never taught to read or write in their native language. And as they grew up, the American English they learned in Oregon schools became their primary language. Like many immigrant communities, my grandparents' generation never taught my mom's generation how to speak Finnish, using English as the primary language at home and choosing only to switch into Finnish when the older generation wanted to talk shit about the kids in front of them. Many such cases. And when my great-grandparents died, my grandmother and her siblings stopped speaking Finnish almost entirely. She remembers very little of it today. And I'm trying to learn the mother tongue, but it's not easy. I've been at it for 4 years now and I barely understand any of it. Cut me some slack here. Finnish is not even an Indo-European language. Like, my great-grandparents really could have done me a solid by being born Dutch or something. Cooking and baking the recipes that were brought over from the old country is one of the few ways we still preserve our Finnish traditions and identity. And the little quirks that family recipes acquire along the way, adding a variety of berries to the pie, speaks to our unique history as Americans. You ought to cook. As always, in any ethical dilemma, if you Emmanuel can't, the prescription doesn't apply to you. Ought implies you Emmanuel can. You ought to cook in order to preserve the recipes that mean something to you, or to find new recipes that you can prepare and serve to the people that mean something to you. If the thing preventing you is not knowing how, seek that knowledge. Ask for help, find tutorials. You may actually really like it. Learning a few solid recipes is empowering, and there's nothing better than feeding someone else and having them love it. Make some of the recipes featured in this video. I intentionally chose recipes that were super easy to make, mostly throw it all in a pot and go recipes. If the thing preventing you is not having the tools to make a recipe, borrow them from a friend or from the library. Lots of local libraries actually allow you to check out all kinds of tools, including cookware, and I think we all should utilize services like that a lot more, even if we can afford to buy our own tools. Like, why do I have a slow cooker that just sits there for most of the year? If you find that there's cookware you're using daily, you can just purchase the essentials. Vintage cookware from resale shops is often cheaper and better quality than even the newer stuff. You ought to cook for your neighbors. Just don't tell Twitter about it if you don't want to get yelled at. Building community is an underrated part of organizing. You start out sharing your family tamale recipe with 5 or 10 people in your building, and before you know it, you're taking your landlord to court in a class action lawsuit. It's called hospitality. You ought to cook if you are a man. Women take on a disproportionate amount of household chores, including cooking. Since the 1960s, the amount of cooking women do has decreased somewhat, and the amount men do has increased, but it still isn't anywhere near parity, and women's personal time has actually decreased, especially if those women happen to be mothers. Women today spend less time in the kitchen than women did in 1965, but they have little free time to show for it. The amount of leisure time that parents enjoy has actually declined since the 1960s. This is especially true for mothers, who have 28 fewer minutes of free time per day on average than fathers. And much of that free time is chopped into tiny segments, or time confetti, as Bridget Schultz writes in Overwhelmed, a book about time pressures working people experience. The time crunch is felt acutely by women, who are more likely than men to report being rushed and plagued by the feeling they can't get everything done. The sense that our modern lives are like a pressure cooker is compounded by competing messages about what parents should be doing with their time. Cook more and spend more quality time with your children. Lean in at work, but also make sure your kids are involved in extracurricular and enrichment activities. So, to the slight majority of men that make up my audience, step the fuck up. Learn to cook and start helping the women in your lives with the chores. And not just taking out the trash or doing the dishes once a week. Start putting in as much work as she does. You ought to cook, but you ought not punish yourself too much for not having the time, energy, or inclination to do it as much as you'd like to or feel you should. That is not a failure on your part. It's a failure on the part of capitalism. Cooking itself isn't classist, but the system that wrings every ounce of energy and labor out of you until you don't have the necessary resources to provide for your own well-being truly is. Be kind to yourself and to others. Okay, well, the video is done, and so is the day. Get out of my house. Shit, that's good. Fuck yeah.